Hi, everyone. Larry DuBois here. Once again, as we continue on in our study through the book of Acts. In this episode, we are in chapter 21, or excuse me, 22. Last week we covered 21. This is episode 43. And of course, once again, broadcasting from my apartment here in Midtown Sacramento. And if we'll do a little bit of a review, last week in Acts 21, we leave off where Paul was being rescued, actually. He was arrested and then was rescued by the Roman garrison there, with the commander pulling Paul out of basically a riot, as he was taking him up a set of stairs to the barracks to basically arrest him. He had encountered a little conversation with the commander and got permission to speak. And that's where we'll pick it up here in 22. And he's speaking to the crowd that wanted him to kill him. But he's taking every opportunity to witness. And so one of the things we're going to see is, let's look at our slideshow here. There's a painting someone had done where try to capture a lot of the commotion that was going on. Paul being led up the stairs and to the Roman barracks there. And I found this picture. It is basically a little outline of a map of the Roman Empire at its fullest capacity there, and it encompasses all of Europe, the known world at the time there, and of course northern Africa and into Palestine, the Holy Land. Yeah, so anyway, as we start, we'll go ahead and we'll get our notes up there. Let's see. And one of the things that Paul, let's see here. One of the things that Paul did in this chapter, we'll see later on, as that I showed you that picture of the Roman Empire, is that he basically had Roman citizenship, and this saved him out of getting a flogging or a scourging. And we'll see how he did that. But let's go ahead and start off. I've already prayed, and so we'll jump right in, and we'll go down several verses at a time. This chapter has 30 verses, and I'll go ahead and start reading the first couple here. There's a kind of an abrupt transition between chapter 21 and 22. It starts right in the middle of his introduction. But anyway, brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. And when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. And then he said, and he starts in here. Now, Paul uses these entreaties as part of his introduction. And of course, he had spoken a couple different languages there, and when they realized that he could speak in the Hebrew language, they perked up a little more. And I don't know if it was because they understood the language better. I have a feeling that it was it had proven that he was, basically one of them. If he knew the Hebrew, then he was definitely a Jew of Jews, and not some sort of outsider that just come in to cause trouble. So that worked to his advantage. And so if a basic, rule in communication, that if you can speak the native language of a people group, by all means do that. A lot of times, I've done this before, is you've had to speak through an interpreter. But he has this introduction. Now he starts off in verse 3 there. I am indeed a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictest of our father's law, and was zealous towards God as you are all today. So he, of course, relates to his audience. Paul, in many of his testimonies, was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He described himself. He was, as he says here, he was a Jew. He was born in the city of Tarsus, but he was brought up in this city, meaning Jerusalem. They were in Jerusalem. That's where he was arrested, at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel, if you remember from way back in Acts chapters 3 and 4 there, he is a respected teacher, probably the most prominent teacher in their schools, and he had given them some advice how to deal with these apostles early on, and they respected him. Now, Paul was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel as a disciple. That's kind of a way to describe a disciple of a teacher back in those days, that they'd sit at the feet. If you remember in the Gospels where Mary and Martha had an argument, basically, and Mary wanted Martha to help her, Martha wanted Mary to help her serve, and it said that Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning and listening. And so that could be in a literal sense, where they'd be standing or perhaps sitting on a stool in a posture of teaching, and the disciples would be sitting, sort of cross-legged on the floor, listening to their every word. But it also is a more than a literal sense. It's the idea that to say I sat at the feet of Gamaliel, being as he was a leading teacher, that was to say, and I basically like saying I went to the best schools. I went to the best Jewish schools. I learned from the best guy possible, and he was probably relocated as a young man as he excelled, and he stood out in all of his early schooling, and you had an opportunity to go learn from the greatest rabbis in the city of Jerusalem. Well, he had this opportunity because he was a great learner and a very overachiever, if you will. And then he goes on to say he was taught according to the strictest of the Father's law. So he was very strict. It said he was zealous towards God as you are all today. And so he was identifying with his audience the best he could. And of course, that would be a good lesson for us. We don't want to embellish our testimony. We don't want to stretch the truth, if you will. But we definitely would want to relate to them. And in this case, if we have any credentials that's going to mean anything to them, then that's a good time to bring them up. Okay, verse 4, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren. And I went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. Okay, so I'm going to drop a couple spaces here. So Paul, before his conversion, he was zealous for the law. He was a Jew, a Pharisee of Pharisees. He persecuted the Christians. And we get this early on in Acts chapter 7 and 8, and up until his conversion in Acts chapter 9. And by the way, you can go back and listen to those if you'd care to on my website, sharingyourfaithradio.com. You can look up all the book of Acts prior to this one in forms of audio podcast. Anyway, he was a persecutor of, and they called this the Way. That was an early reference to these group of Christians. They were initially from the Jewish race, and they were called a sect. They were called the Way. That was one of the names for them. In modern history now, we got this false teacher, Herbert Armstrong, and the Way, and that's what they call themselves. So it's like all the good biblical names that are taken for Christians, it seems like these false prophets and cults have taken the names and used them, so we can't use them. We don't want to be identified with anything like that. But they were called the Way, and it said he was binding and delivering them to prisons. and both men and women. It didn't matter to him. He wasn't going to spare the women, whoever was in his way. He was so zealous, thought he was helping out God by doing this, that he was arresting them. In fact, he went so far and he was saying, look, you can ask the high priest. He's a witness. And all the elders, they knew I was doing this. He's got them as a witness, and he got letters from them. And he wanted to go to Damascus. And that's what he was doing at the time. And as we see, as he got converted, but it says it was to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. So his mission was to go to Damascus with letters of the authority of the chief priests in Jerusalem, and to take all those who are of the way and arrest them and bring them back to the city of Jerusalem. Now it happened as I journeyed, verse 6 here, and came near Damascus at about noon. Suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. So I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all things that you are appointed for me to do. All right, I pointed out here, I put Jesus' words in red, just like in the Bible. So again, don't embellish when sharing your testimony, but he was describing the experience he had, that all of a sudden, on his way to Damascus, a great light from heaven shone around him, and a voice came out of heaven. Why are you persecuting me? This had to be very shocking to him. So he says, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. Now the guys that with him, they saw the light, they were afraid of it, but they didn't hear the voice of him who spoke. Now, so what does he do? His response, Who are you, Lord? And then after that, what shall I do? Well, it says, the Lord said to me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all things of which are appointed for you to do. Now, this is an interesting concept we see in the things of the Lord. There is a saying out there that goes something like this: more will be revealed. And a lot of times, if you are called to a missionary work, or the Lord's calling you to something, he tends to reveal a little bit at a time. He doesn't give you the whole thing all at once. I'm not sure for all the reasons. One could be that he wants to see if you'll obey just the initial instruction. We see this in Acts chapter 8 when he instructs Philip the evangelist, a step by step. First it was go down to the road that leads to Gaza. Then it was to overtake the chariot. Then it was to go up and sit with the guy. So a little bit more will be revealed as we're obedient to what God has shown us clearly, and then he will give us more. That's the idea. Plus, if he gives us it all at once, we may either be too overwhelmed, or we may forget. We may forget a lot of it. So it's just a little here, a little there. Okay, verse 11, and since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. Then a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there, came to me, and he stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that same hour I looked up at him. Then he said, The God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know his will and see the just one, and hear the voice of his mouth. For you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. All right, so we'll stop there for a minute. I'm going to make some spaces there. Of course, the light was so bright that came out of heaven, it blinded him. So he had to be led by the hand by other people into the city. There was a man called Ananias, and if you go back to Acts chapter 9, you'll see the conversation the Lord had with this man to instruct him to go and find Paul, or Saul was his name at this time, to go and find him and tell him this stuff. And so when Paul's recounting this to this Jewish crowd, he wants to emphasize that this Ananias was not just some fly-by-night guy, but that he was devout according to the law, and he had a good testimony with all the Jews that dwelt there. So he was trying to emphasize, strengthen his case by bringing up that these are Jewish guys that are involved in all of this. See, okay, so he prayed with the guy, with Paul. Paul received his sight. He was able to look up. Of course, during this time, I don't think Paul mentions it here, but he went 3 days and 3 nights without eating. But Ananias tells him, the God of our fathers has chosen you to know his will and see the just one. Now, this is important, and to hear the voice of his mouth. These original apostles, not counting Paul was not an original apostle, they had seen the Lord. Remember, if you go back to Acts chapter 1, and as they picked out a replacement for Judas, they had some qualifications. They had some criteria there for this guy. He had to be with them from the time of John the Baptist. They had to have seen the resurrection. They had to be partakers of all of that. And so to be an original apostle, you had to see the Lord. Well, the Lord had ascended into heaven, and he was done showing himself around Jerusalem for those 40 days. That was all over with. This was sometime later. So he makes a special visit to Paul, a revelation, and Paul sees him. He sees him and he hears him. And this is what Paul has as his credentials of being an apostle. As he states in 1 Corinthians 15, he's one born out of due time. In other words, he was not an original one. But nevertheless, he did the signs of an apostle, and it was very evident that God was using this man. But the suffering he had to go through was one of the distinct things of his calling. As it says there in verse 14 there, that you should know his will. That was the will of God for Paul, that he would suffer many things. And of course, to be his witness. And his witness was going to be to the Gentiles as well as the Jews, to the kings, to people in high places. Okay, now in verse 16, now, why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem, when I was praying in the temple, I was in a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Okay, well, first of all, he jumps forward there in verse 18, actually 17. So let's drop that down a minute and take on verse 16 here. So he basically says, look, don't wait any longer. Arise, get baptized. This idea of washing away your sins, that's not something that water baptism doesn't literally do that, but it is a euphemism, if you will, to express that by being converted, which was what baptism represented. You're going down. You're being identified with Christ. You're crucified. You come up with a new nature, a new man, and you're converted, and your sins are forgiven. And so that's the idea. Baptism was a lot more important, it seemed like, to those guys back then. And of course, I got some articles on that on my website, lawrencedubois.com. If you care to go there and punch in the terms baptism, you'll see those articles. More of a topical study. Now, verse 17, now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple that I was in a trance, and I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony. Well, this is a good thing to do, is when the Lord gives you direction, you get a change of direction, and you think you should be doing something else, is to listen to the Lord, even if it goes against logic. Going back to Acts chapter 8, we see Philip the evangelist. He was involved in this great revival in the city of Samaria, and he was told by an angel to go down, to leave that and to go down on a deserted road where no one was virtually until he saw this Ethiopian eunuch come by. And so he might have thought to himself, "This is crazy. Why am I doing this? It doesn't seem logical." But that was the Lord's plan, and so we are to obey the Lord. Now, Paul, so he's saying, "Look, hurry up and get out of there. They're not going to receive the testimony." Now here Paul's arguing with him. Well, I don't want to say argue, but he's trying to bring a case to the Lord. And here's what he says. "So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprison and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then he said to me, Depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles." Okay, so first of all, a lesson to be learned here, I put down there in the blue. Our former peers may not listen to the gospel just because we've changed. We think that somehow by identifying with this group that you have a right to speak to them and say, "Look, I was one of you, and now I'm converted, and you should be too." Sometimes that's a very effective testimony. Typically, jail ministers, for example, in our modern time, a lot of the ministries that are involved in jail ministry, prison ministry, these are ex-prisoners that have gone through it. And so that's sort of normal, but you don't have to be. A lot of times an effective one is someone that's never gone to jail. The Lord can use both. And so that's what he does. But we can't presume that just because, for example, I have a background, I was a heroin addict for a while, and I've gone back into that lifestyle, if you will, to witness to other heroin addicts. And because I can speak their language, because I can identify with them. In fact, when I bring it up, the fact that I used to be a heroin addict, I get their attention. Just like Paul got these guys' attention early on by saying, "Look, I was a Pharisee, I'm one of you guys." So they listened to him. But sometimes they only listen up to a certain point. And like those heroin addicts, they may only listen up to a certain point, and then they think, "Yeah, you know what, it's not for me." So then they reject it, and then they can turn on you, and get upset with you. You're kind of, "Oh, you're pushing your religion on me," or whatever. Well, in this case, he's trying to make a case before the Lord that, "Look, if I stick around, I really can convert them. Lord, just give me some time here." But he said, "No, depart, I will send you far from here to the Gentiles." And this was a theme, as we see through the book of Acts, that as Paul several times went to the Jews first, they rejected for the most part. He said, "Okay, I go to the Gentiles." It calls him an apostle to the Gentiles. And that was a big part of his ministry, was to bring it to the unknown world, to the pagan world there in all parts of Greece and everywhere. Okay, so let's see, verse 22. "And they listened to him until this word, and then they raised their voices and said, 'Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live.' Then as they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust in the air." Okay, so they're very zealous people, these Jews. And it said they listened to him until this word. What word? The word about the Gentiles. They had basically a prejudice against the Gentiles, and they did not see, even though the Old Testament revealed that the gospel would eventually, the things of God would go to the Gentiles, they did not receive that. They rejected that notion, and that was a big part of it. It was hard enough for them to accept that Jesus was this Messiah, but then when you start to say that, yeah, and he has a plan for the Gentiles as the same plan he has for us, the Jews just got upset at that notion and rejected it. And it goes to show you that's why the Lord has to really call someone to salvation. He has to be drawn by the Lord. Otherwise, we're blinded. We're not going to see it. And these Jews were definitely very adamant, and it stirred them up so much now they wanted to kill him again. He's not fit to live, he's not fit. Get him out of here. So they were, uh, so to rip their clothes, to throw dust in the air, that was an outward manifestation of them saying this is outrageous, and their high objection to it. Um, So in verse 24, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, that they should examine him under scourging, so they might know what they shouted so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" And when the centurion heard that, he went and told the commander, saying, "Take care what you do, for this man is a Roman." Then the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" He said, "Yes." The commander answered, "With a large sum I have obtained this citizenship." And Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander also was afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because they had bound him. The next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down to set him before them. So he basically brings him up into the barracks, and he could have just asked him, "Why are they so mad at you?" But he thought that if we scourge you, we'll get the truth out of you or something. These guys were brutal back in the first century. I mean, they thought nothing of scourging and flogging and just brutalization. Even Pilate, when he wanted to set Jesus free, he said, he didn't believe him to be guilty of death. So he says, "Well, I know he's innocent, but look, I'll go ahead and flog him and then I'll let him go." Well, if he's innocent, don't even flog him. That was my thinking, but they had no problems with doing these things. So they were ready to scourge him. These idea of thongs, they were like, I guess, there was a contraption to hold his hands, to bound him with those, so he couldn't squirm out of it. And so Paul just asks a simple question, and of course, according to Roman law, they could not go through with any kind of punishment until they had a formal trial. That he had not been proven guilty, and he was like in our laws today, he was. According to the law, he was able to face his accusers. They had to prove that he was guilty of what they said he was. So they couldn't just haul off. If you were a citizen, they couldn't just haul off and start wailing on you until you had a fair trial, basically. So Paul, brings it up. He's basically asking them a rhetorical question, saying, "Hey, I'm a Roman. It's not lawful for you to do this." But he says it in form of a question. Will they go and tell the commander? Now, it's interesting how the commander, he doesn't ask for proof. I mean, I don't know. They didn't carry around a passport card or nothing that I'm aware of to prove he's a citizen. He took his word for it. I imagine if you lied about it, it probably could be the death penalty or something. So that was incentive to know that these people weren't going to lie. So yes, he is a Roman citizen, and he used this quite often. A lot of times he gave up his rights, but a lot of times he used it to his advantage. And of course, the commander said, "Hey, I'm a citizen too, but I bought it with a large sum of money." He's probably thinking, "How'd you become one?" And he was born a citizen. Well, that carried a little more weight, I guess, if you're born a citizen. So those that were ready to flog him all of a sudden go, "Okay, they're out of there, man." They withdrew from him and say, "Look, we're not going to touch this guy." And now the commander he's a little afraid because he didn't want Paul, if the authorities, the overseers of this guy, the commander, his boss, if they found out that he was close to doing this, he could have maybe got in trouble. So he was a little worried. It was like, "Hey, Paul, don't say nothing. We didn't know. We're not going to hurt you here now. So just keep it quiet," because he shouldn't even have bound him, basically. All right. So then the next day, they wanted to know for certain. So they commanded this group to get together, and they were going to bring him down to some sort of civil hearing. And as we're going to see next time, and so Paul was spared that beating. We're going to see next time in Acts 23, what happens at this hearing that the Romans decide to have with all these Jewish chief priests and leaders. But until then, next time, my friends, uh, God bless you, and I hope you enjoyed the video, or in the case of a podcast, audio only, the audio portion. And until we see you next time, God bless.